and welcome back to another GiantSlayerTV patch rundown video. Today we'll be diving into the newest patch, 11.13. Compared to the previous patch, this one is a bit tamer, but still has plenty of changes. Overall, it should rock the boat less than previous patches and hopefully brings much needed stability to set 5. With a fair amount to cover, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we get into the balance adjustments, we need to first cover the system changes being introduced in 11.13. All of the system changes in this patch are to the armory system. For starters, the newly added consumables, magnetic remover, and reforgers are going bye-bye from armories. They can still show up as drops from loot orbs, but for the armory, they're gone. This is a good change because there are not a lot of situations where either of these consumables were better than a full item or a special item like Nico's help. They basically bogged down late game armories. Speaking of those armories, they've increased the chances of there being a 4-2 armory and reduced the chance of an armory on 5-2. Likely what this points to is them going back to 4-2, happening every game with stage 5 and on being random armory stages. A quick sum up of the rest of the changes are all special items, those being Nico's help, spatulas, loaded dice, and emblems will appear less frequently, while full items will appear more often. Overall, this is a welcome change as the special items are often game-changing, so reducing how often they appear will help lower the endgame variance that we saw in 11.12. Emblem RNG was also an issue, so having them show up less is good. All in all, the armory is an interesting system that hopefully sticks with the game in future sets, meaning set 5 has the unfortunate task of being the tester for the new mechanic. That's all for system changes, so let's switch over to talking about traits. Interestingly, they've broken down the patch notes between large changes and small ones. What's odd is the only large change they listed is to skirmishers, which gives a buff to 6 and 9 parts of the trait. Those buffs increase the skirmisher shield to 45-75% from 40-60% for 6 and 9 of the trait. While buffing 6 skirmishers makes sense, considering skirmishers were doing poorly in 11.12, buffing 9 is unlikely to ever be relevant. In some cases it will, but let's be real, going 9 is extremely difficult already, and skirmishers are better off rolling for 3-star upgrades. But who knows, maybe we'll see skirmishers rise up again in the mid-game and stabilize long enough to go to level 9. The rest of the trait changes are listed as small, but some of them are quite impactful. Abomination, for example, is being nerfed without any compensation. Those nerfs are a reduction to the base attack damage of the monstrosity as well as the scaling. This feels far more impactful than the skirmisher change because Abomination is often a commonly run trait in the mid-game, but it's by no means that strong. Abomination essentially stabilizes a player's board as it doesn't tend to scale well into the late game, so nerfing how well it does in the mid-game makes it less relevant in the meta. Maybe it won't end up mattering all that much since Abomination is just a vehicle to the late game, but worth noting, nerfs without compensation never feel great. Another important change is to Forgotten, as they're reducing the base attack damage and ability power to 25-60-125 from 30-70-140. Relatively small adjustments, but enough to reduce the effectiveness of Forgotten without any shadow items. The goal of making Forgotten the go-to trait with shadow items is made apparent as they're buffing the scaling per shadow item from 10% to 15%. What this looks to be is them saying play Forgotten when you have multiple shadow items. It's a bit contrived, but fits with the theme of Forgotten, so it is what it is. As for the rest of the traits, they're relatively small changes. Ironclad takes a hit with the armor bonus going from 40-90-180 to 35-85-170. Maybe with this nerf, we'll begin to see more AD compositions pop up in the 11.13 meta. Knights needed a bit of love at lower tiers, so now the block amount is going to 20-40-70 from 15-40-80. Nerfing 6 Knights is likely due to the Kale changes we'll talk about later. And the last semi-relevant change is a small buff to 2 Ranger, as the attack speed bonus is going up to 75% from 70%. It's not much, but attack speed scales a lot even in small amounts, so this directly buffs champions like Aphelios and maybe even carry Ashe. That's it for traits, so let's now move on to champion changes. There's a fair amount to cover here, so we'll start with the largest changes first, which are reworks to a few champions, beginning with Trundle. Trundle got hit real hard by the nerf bat, as stealing stats was a bit too powerful against high-value units, particularly those that were 3-starred. They've recognized this interaction is not healthy for the game, so as a way to rework Trundle, they're turning his stats stealing into a flat 35% at all levels, while the amount gained by Trundle scales more for 8 seconds. That scaling is 100, 130, 200%, and is modified by his AP. It's still advisable to avoid having an important unit directly against an enemy Trundle, but at least if it does happen, your unit shouldn't be significantly weaker anymore. Instead, Trundle will be more like a melee carry, which does change his role in skirmishers, maybe even opening the door to itemizing him as a carry. We'll have to wait and see how this rework pans out as the meta develops. The next rework is to Nidalee to help her turn more into a proper 3-cost carry. Balancing Nidalee has proved difficult with crit and dodge being powerful on her, so her dodge chance is now 45% at all levels. In addition to that, she gains 40, 50, 75% attack speed, and every 4th attack is a bonus 200, 300, 600 magic damage. All in all, it looks like Nidalee should be a formidable carry during the mid-game and is an item holder. It's tough to determine how well she'll scale past that, but in the very least, if you hit an early Nidalee, you should be able to use her comfortably until you find a proper 4-cost carry later. And the last rework is to Kayle, which is less of a true rework and more of just a bunch of number adjustments. Let's rapid fire list them, with her health going from 500 to 650, attack damage to 70 from 65, and attack speed to 1.1 from 1.0. In addition to that, the number of attacks per immunity is now 15 from 10, and her AoE damage in the 4th Ascension phase is down to 80, 125 from 200, 300. Overall, the goal here is to make Kayle actually useful prior to hitting a huge power spike in the 4th Ascension. With several base stats increased, she'll still be hitting much harder and faster, but won't instantly win fights as the AoE damage is reduced significantly. Honestly, the theme of Kayle is hard to balance since you want her to be strong the longer the fight goes on. Because that's difficult to balance around, we've seen Kayle go up and down on the balance roller coaster. With the mid set on the horizon, it may be a good idea for them to just remove Kayle to get rid of the headache of balancing her. That's it for the larger reworks, but there's plenty of champions receiving significant meta changes. Every Hellion but Lulu is receiving adjustments in this patch, with Poppy getting several buffs including her ability's damage and the shield it gains. Plus, her mana is going down to 70 from 80, though her starting mana difference is the same, so it will only affect subsequent casts. Kled gets a minor shift in his role as he wanted to be more of a damage dealer, with his attack speed going up to 0.75 from 0.7 and gaining bonus damage every 4th attack while mounted. Likely he'll still be mainly used as a frontline trait bot, but the potential for him to do damage is at least there. Ziggs is becoming a squishy boy as his health is down to 450 from 500, but to compensate, his ability damage is going up to 250, 375, 525 from 250, 350, 450. Next are decent buffs to Kennen, with his starting mana going from 50 to 60, and his damage going to 150, 225, 350 from 150, 200, 250. Looking at all these Hellion buffs, especially to their tier 3 stats, opens the doorway for Hellion reroll to enter the meta once again. We've already seen that Ziggs 3 can carry even in 11-12, albeit rarely, so we may see it happen more frequently in 11-13. The last Hellion change is to Teemo, with a nerf to his ability going from 140, 175 damage to 130, 160. Small enough he's still plenty strong, but necessary since the stack Teemo 2 was able to devastate boards on his own. Moving away from Hellion, Soraka 3 receives a nerf, with the mana reave increase now being 35% at all levels. This essentially makes Soraka carry in Coven even less relevant than it already was. Varus gets nerfed on his ability's attack damage ratio, which is odd since he's not all that powerful beyond the early game, at least in terms of his own damage. This may be a reactionary nerf to the 2 Ranger buff. Ashe is receiving a bit of a buff as her ultimate damage is going up to 300, 450, 750 from 300, 400, 600. Draconic is still difficult to do well with, but these buffs may help the trait be more relevant. More than likely, it just makes Ashe slightly better when running 4 Ranger builds. Unsurprisingly, Yasuo is being nerfed. His overall damage is down, with the initial hit going to 250, 350, 700 damage from 300, 400, 750. And the on-hit damage is down to 25, 35, 70 from 30, 40, 75. Due to Nightbringer and having true damage, Yasuo should still be fine as a carry, though 2-starring him is going to be very important for his longevity in the game. Ryze is also receiving a much-needed nerf, as permastunning an entire board is kind of overpowered. But they aren't addressing his interaction with Dark Blue buff. Instead, they're reducing the stun duration to secondary targets to be half of the main targets. This means they'll be stunned for 0.7512 seconds, making Ryze less scary than before. More than likely, they will still need to look into itemization on Ryze in future patches. Jax may be back with his attack speed going up to 0.9 from 0.85. Keep in mind, attack speed scales well, so this is a decent buff for helping Jax ramp up in fights. This, coupled with the skirmisher buff and other skirmisher changes, may help push the composition back into a stable spot. And the last relevant balance change is a nerf to Karma, with their damage going down to 225-280 from 240-300. Pretty expected nerf considering how dominant Karma was in the 11-12 meta. Alright, that's it for champions. Let's now move on to item changes. By far the largest change is the Sacrificial Infinity Edge, as it's receiving a rework. Instead of doing damage to the holder for every tick of critical damage, it will instead do it on attack and ability cast. Having healing is still going to be necessary, but the item will be less punishing on champions with multiple hits per cast like Vel'Koz. Opening up more itemization options is always a good thing. A more meta-relevant change is a nerf to Shadow Locket, with the armor and magic resistance gained going from 70 to 60. Certainly expected by anyone familiar with the 11-12 meta, as this item was coveted by players in the early game. That said, it's still going to be plenty strong in Forgotten boards, especially with the scaling buff the trait received. Redemption is also being nerfed down to 25% AoE damage reduction from 30%. This means we may see more Vel'Koz, as itemizing to counter him will be slightly more difficult. Plus, it will help make unkillable knight compositions with Taric less unkillable. Archdemon Staff is going down to 350% from 400% of the user's mana ratio, as we've seen it do a bit too well in the mid-game on champions like Vladimir and Warwick. Still, it's a bit sad to see it nerfed because it helped enable interesting compositions, and now those builds, which were barely consistent placing in top 4, will be weaker and thus even less consistent. Okay, what's the deal with the Giant Slayer change? Sure, the threshold going down from 1650 to 750 is nice, making the bonus damage more likely to occur, but why lower the damage to 75% from 80%? It's not like the item is even overpowered in the meta. It's a strange change, to say the least. And the last item change is to Eclipse. The self-burn is going from permanent to only the first 8 seconds of combat. This is a fairly large buff to the item in the early game, where rounds tend to last a longer time. It's a great change that may prove to be a bit too good. That's going to be it for today's video, folks. We recommend reading the patch notes to get a full list of the changes. It also helps to keep the patch notes open during your games to double check what was changed, especially for patches with a lot of changes to keep track of. Let us know in the comment section below what change you're the most excited for. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.